Chapter 1. Greyson loved the metallic scrape and snap of the Zippo lid whenever he flicked it open. It satisfied some itch at the base of his skull. Almost as satisfying was the harsh click when he pushed the lid shut with his thumb. He stared into the distance and lost himself in a kind of trance to the click-snap of the lighter. Only the setting sun finally pulled him out of it. He snapped the lid shut again, bounced the lighter in his hand a couple of times, then angled the side into the burnished orange sunlight. The side of the Zippo had a raised design of a leering skull with red glass eyes. He ran his thumb over both eyes before jamming the lighter into the breast pocket of his denim shirt. The high grass on the hilltop was moving in waves with the wind. He could see the ripples down the hillside and across the broad meadow below. It made him feel like he was standing in hip-deep water, somehow poised on top of a wave. No, not a wave, rather a storm surge pushed in advance of a great hurricane, and its target stood in the distance, a sad collection of brick and wood buildings standing in a nimbus of orange light. Though he couldn't quite make out the people from this distance, all he could see were gray and brown rooftops among the trees, a few narrow roads, and dead vehicles scattered about like detritus. He could sense the citizens. They called it New West Point, a name that was stuck in his brain like a thorn. Greyson began to pace, kicking through the high grass, feeling some hot, hateful thing rising up inside of him. The town was little more than a wart on the side of an insignificant country road west of Macon, but only if one viewed it objectively. Greyson knew it now as a vicious little camp of petty elitists. Oh, they were there, lurking in their homes, in their precious little community center, in their weedy gardens. He saw thin tendrils of dark smoke from cooking fires, and it made him smile. Sort of ironic, he thought. Cooking meat. Greyson couldn't help it. He pulled the lighter out again and began to flick it open and shut again. All the ways those people had wronged him were rooting through his mind, and he had been unable to rest for weeks. Sleep eluded him. Dreams tormented him in the darkest hours of the night. He fixed his gaze on the community center with its multicolored rooftop of mismatched tiles, the product of storm repairs. One of the trails of smoke came from the fenced playground in back, where he knew the local mayor kept a large barbecue grill. He couldn't see the playground from this angle, but he could picture it well enough. His final humiliation had happened there. "I did nothing but help you," Greyson muttered. The emotion in his own trembling voice disturbed him, so he took a moment to collect himself before speaking again. "Nothing but help you." Yes, that was better. A cool and collected voice. Even in his solitary moments, he liked to maintain control. He needed it. "And you silenced me, turned me out, took my things, took my home." And then quietly, in little more than a whisper, he added, "How dare you?" He began to pace, kicking through the high weeds on top of the hill, his obsessive need to flick the lighter insatiable. Finally, he began tossing it in the air and catching it, if only to have something else to do. Occasionally, he held it tightly and ran his thumb along the skull's red glass eyes for a minute. A conversation was playing over and over again in his mind. He'd been sitting in the front row in the little meeting room at the community center. Folding metal chairs with thin plastic seat pads that had cracked in many places. In the lack of air conditioning, the room was warm and muggy and smelled like dirty people. The room was full and everyone was restless. He could hear their chairs creaking and popping. The mayor stood at his podium, leaning on it so heavily with his huge, corpulent forearms that the podium was tipped forward. The accusation in those beady little eyes had been enough to make Greyson want to pick up his chair and heave it at the man. "All I've tried to do is help this damn loser town." Yes, Greyson had lost his cool for just a second, but he'd quickly pulled it back. "Didn't I help set up the community garden? Didn't I bring the wagon and coordinate the clearing out of abandoned houses? Didn't I inventory the communal storehouse? Why am I being treated like a criminal?" Even then, he got at least a few nods. He'd had at least a few allies left in the town, but the majority made it clear they'd turned against him. "At every turn, you've helped yourself more than you've helped others," the mayor said. "How dare you say that?" Greyson managed an even tone that time. He sounded so calm, even though he was raging inside. "After all the work I've done." "You've helped yourself to whatever you wanted," the mayor said, speaking right over him. "You've picked over the supplies and cooked the books to hide it. You've manipulated others and taken advantage of them." Voices behind him. Greyson looked over his shoulder and saw row upon row of accusing eyes staring back at him. All these grimy, dirty, backwoods weirdos. The memory of that meeting made him so furious that his stomach hurt. He'd done his best to defend himself. He'd only taken his fair share, after all. But they'd eventually all ganged up on him. Even the few who had supported him in the beginning became hostile by meeting's end. And now here he was, standing alone on a hilltop beyond the boundaries of the high, makeshift fence that encircled the town. The simple fact that he'd been able to walk out of town with his dignity, resisting the urge to lash out, was an achievement in itself. So what if he'd taken a few things along the way for himself? Hadn't he earned everything he'd taken? Shut up, shut down, and shut out. That's what they'd done to him. A faint echo of laughter reached him then, carried on the wind. It went right through him, and he shuddered. He felt a trembling in his guts, and it was almost more than he could stand. "They don't care what happens to me," he thought. "They'd have killed me if they had the guts to do it. Listen to them laugh while I'm cast out like a leper. I deserved better." He flicked the lighter open one more time, but this time he left it there. His thumb slid down and rested on the wheel, feeling the rough texture. It had been a dry season, warm air devoid of moisture coming from the west. He felt the stickiness of his sweaty shirt against his back, against his shoulder, his belly. "The only justice left in the world is the justice we take for ourselves," he muttered. And with that, he spun the wheel, and the wick burst into a single, perfect flame. He held it up in front of his face so that the flame became a veil standing between him and the distant community. If there was any hesitation at all in that moment, it was like a single flickering of that flame. Greyson bent down and touched the flame to the tips of the high grass around him. The fire caught fast, as he suspected it would. The land had prepared itself for his judgment. He began walking along the top of the hill, dragging the lighter through the grass and weeds. As he did, he heard the crackle and pop of fire behind him. When he reached the far slope, he made his way down the back of the hill, still moving the lighter through the grass. The wind would carry it east, toward the town, and since there wasn't a cloud in the sky, there was little chance that any natural phenomenon would stop it. Eventually, he stepped out of the high grass onto an old country road, and he came to a stop. The Zippo had become uncomfortably hot against his fingertips, so he snapped the lid shut. Then he turned to survey his handiwork. He'd left a line of angry fire in his wake, and it was already spreading. The dry grass was like kindling. Within minutes, the whole top of the hill was crowned in angry red flames, thick black smoke rising into the slate-blue sky. The heat was unbearable against his face, forcing Greyson back across the road to the ditch on the other side. "In the last seconds, when judgment is bearing down, you'll regret what you did," he thought, casting his hateful thoughts toward the townsfolk. Even then, as the fire turned into a great wall stretching along the road, catching in the trees, his thoughts went back to that last fateful town meeting. The moment they'd all turned against him, the moment when he'd realized he was truly alone. But this time, he saw one individual in particular, that greasy-haired fellow with the pale pink skin, a relative newcomer to the community by the name of Ryan, and, in Greyson's estimation, a hardcore socialist nut-job loser. "People working for their own advantage. That's the reason I had to leave my hometown," Ryan had said. And then he pointed one of his long, crooked fingers at Greyson and continued, "If you let a guy like this stay here, he'll worm his way into the mind of every person in town sooner or later. He'll turn us against our own collective interest. I've seen it happen. I saw one family do it. They basically took over my hometown, and that was the end of it. Cast this guy out now while he's still weak and unliked." "You can burn with your ideas, Ryan," Greyson thought. Oh, Ryan had told all kinds of interesting stories about his former hometown, some new community on the east side of Macon near the Okmulgee River. Greyson had listened to all of his stories. He'd tried to indulge Ryan, if only to keep him malleable, and what good had it done? Ryan's hometown had weathered an attack by some biker gang, apparently, and their current mayor had killed a bunch of them in the street like dogs. Or so the story went. Despite Ryan's complaints, it sounded like the place was thriving, even in his absence. A gust of wind swept over Greyson, rustling his oversized denim jacket which he had worn for far too many days. He tucked the lighter back into its breast pocket and moved back a bit farther. The wind caught the growing flames and pushed them into a small stand of trees. Within seconds, the leaves caught fire and began to smolder. Then the branches turned into dozens of blazing torches. The sight of it produced such a deep, aching sense of satisfaction that tears sprung into Greyson's eyes. He wiped them away, laughed, and forced himself to turn from the sight. If the townsfolk hadn't seen the wall of fire rising to the west, they would soon. As much as he wanted to watch the show, Greyson didn't dare risk being caught. He cinched up the straps on his backpack, scratched at his whiskery cheeks and chin, and turned southeast. The road he was standing on took a meandering course south of Macon before hitting a highway near Rutland. From there, he could turn north and reach this other community within a day or two. Thanks to Ryan, he knew enough about the community to have some advantage there. It was worth a shot, and he'd learned a few important lessons about dealing with people thanks to the humiliation of New West Point. With the rising heat behind him and the growing roar of fire sweeping across field and trees toward the town, Greyson set off down the road, fighting the tears and laughter with every step.